Welcome to Psychoanalysis and You, the official podcast of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I'm your host, Dr. Gail Saltz. The American Psychoanalytic Association is the largest U.S. member organization of professional psychoanalysts, and this podcast will highlight the work of various member analysts and how that work can be of use to you in your day-to-day life. So my guest today for Psychoanalysis and You is Alexander Stein. He is a psychoanalyst, a founder of Dolus Advisors, a strategic consultancy specializing in leadership, organizational governance, culture, fraud, corruption, and abuses of power, human risks in cybersecurity, and technologies that assume decision-making functions in human affairs. He is also sits on the committee with me, the Committee for Public Information at the American Psychoanalytic Association, and he serves on the board, the advisory board of CIAN, and he is at work on the CAI Report, which is the American Psychoanalytic Association's report about everything artificial intelligence, which is sort of a new initiative, and doing very interesting work on that committee as well. So thank you and welcome to Alexander for joining me today.
Thank you, Gail. It's great to be with you.
Great to be with you as well. So you have a very interesting and different path from a lot of psychoanalysts, and we're going to dive right in and understand how you got there and what you do and why this is so relevant to psychoanalysis today. You were a clinical psychoanalyst practicing in your office, as we all do, and you changed careers essentially to running this business that uses psychoanalysis to help leaders in business be better at their jobs. So can you tell us, first of all, what even made you think of that? What motivated this change? I'm curious.
So let me start the origin story just a little bit before that pivot point. I actually came to psychoanalysis first as a musician and had an early career after conservatory training as a performing pianist, and decided in my late 20s that I wanted to make a complete change for a number of personal reasons having to do with wanting to start a family and have a career that allowed me to be at home and be a more involved father of the children yet to be born. And so I started scanning the universe for another life, and as one does, decided to become a psychoanalyst. I shook the Etch-a-Sketch and went back to school, entered analytic training, and progressed with the same kind of discipline and dedication to that field that I had grown up with as a classical musician, used to practicing many hours every day and, striving for excellence. And perhaps relevantly to part of the career that I have now, which involves public-facing and outward-facing work, writing, I became involved in integrating, as a part of my transitional process, being a musician with being a psychoanalyst. And so I was involved with the American Psychoanalytic Association's Music and Psychoanalysis Discussion Group, which was then headed by the late Stuart Fader, who was a mentor of mine. And published a number of works early in my career, some of which even when I was still a candidate, in many of the important psychoanalytic journals on the intersection of music and psychoanalysis. And that became one of the foundational pillars of my fledgling career, which was at that point relatively conventional in terms of being a scholar clinician. So I was building my young practice and starting to see patients and publishing in journals and speaking at conferences and doing everything that one is taught to do to have a career as a successful clinical psychoanalyst. There was, however, something percolating inside me that was not entirely settled with that life. And I think a lot of it had to do with coming from my earlier career as a musician, where I was constantly socializing and out on the road and doing certain things that were not just quietly contained in an office. And it's wonderful work and deeply gratifying and important and meaningful, but I was challenged to envision myself just doing that for the rest of my life. And
It is
then,
it is very fairly solitary work, and I think
yeah,
well suited for some people to. This is true, whatever your mental health practice, right? That it's one on one, and it can be very
hmm
solitary. And
hmm
a lot of people in our field, for that reason, do find that that element is a struggle for them and their personality. And over time, it can lead to some burnout. So it's interesting that early on you
hmm
were already thinking about this in yourself.
yeah, it presented a little bit of a tension point for myself, having already changed careers. I was initially concerned about have I made a mistake? What am I going to do now? And decided to just work with that rather than to become anxious about it. And then 9/11 happened. And my wife and I lived across the street from the World Trade Center. And that was a decisive moment in our life, as well as many, many others. We were pregnant with our first child, who is now 22 and thriving. Nonetheless, the experience of that, being geographically dislocated, we lost our home. We were essentially urban refugees for a while, on the verge of having a baby. Kind of fundamentally altered my perspective of many different things and helped to crystallize some of my thinking around who am I, what am I doing, what kind of person do I want to be in the world, what kind of father do I want to be, how am I going to contend with everything that's happening right now. And fundamentally, one of the things that it focused my attention on was how people in leadership positions were responding, the ways in which there was this extraordinary hypocrisy and discrepancy between what we were actually experiencing when we would go on what we called recon missions back to our apartment to try to extract stuff, with how things were being presented to the world about the resurgence of Wall Street, and the work, and everything is coming back and the world is fine, and it absolutely was not. And we were contending with so many things in politics and business in which there was this presentation of pseudo-normalcy, which was absolutely at odds with what everyone was actually experiencing, and certainly what I was experiencing. And it began to focus my attention on the direction that I wanted to go in, which was to be able to have the ability to do something about that. In other words, to have more touch points and take psychoanalytic ideas and precepts and practice out into a broader marketplace, and to work with people who are in positions of power, influence, and authority, not just as patients in their own lives, but in their organizations and into society. And so that was the initial point of entry, and there's more to the story, but I'll pause there for a moment.
So you had this training. You practiced with patients. You understood the theory. You understood how it could be helpful to individuals in their lives. But you turned to this thought that actually these same theories and the same work principles could really be helpful in an organizational way to these sorts of businesses. How did you envision this as different from, for example, management consulting, which, purports to solve problems for businesses? They're the ones who've kept the gate closed, and that's where it resides, problem solving for businesses. How is this different? How did you envision you were bringing something other than that, what they bring?
So I was not obviously at the absolute vanguard of doing this sort of work. My friend and colleague Carrie Sulkowitz has been doing this for many years, and there are predecessors to him, Katz de Vries and Abraham Zalesnik, and many others who have taken psychoanalysis into the corporate setting. So there was no wheel invention on my part. But to directly answer your question, the the training as a clinician orients us to diagnosis, right, which is an absolute first step to understanding what a good solution will be. And so I would suggest that that's the first of several important differentiators from conventional management consulting, where by and large, consultants have off-the-shelf template solutions to a range of problems where they walk into an organization, or as the case may be, and make an initial assessment as to what best practices are not being utilized or what's out of alignment and how that can be changed. My perspective has always been almost as if it were like a patient, in terms of trying to make an initial evaluation of what's actually happening here and why is it the way it is. So in essence, trying to look back into history to understand the present situation that the organization and its leaders or its board may be in, as a starting point for building solutions that will be workable for that organization in context. So in certain regards, it's a variation on a theme of clinical practice and proper technique in terms of customizing an understanding of what's happening and what's needed to be able to facilitate good solution building.
So how much of it, though, so in management consulting, as you said, they're identifying the problem and they're coming up with sort of nuts and bolts solutions to those problems that may be, financial, organizational, um, how much of what you're doing has to do with the fact that leaders and organizations come with their own unconscious bias, their own personal histories,
Mm-hmm.
their own personality, let's say, uh, gifts and difficulties
Mm-hmm.
that they bring to the situation, that they may or may not realize are working or not working for them, and then that imposes a group dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
that moves all the way down in the same sort of way that we as clinicians, as you said, might see an individual patient and they are the leader or the identified patient, and that they operate in a relational way and in a group way that may be causing dysfunction. Is that sort of um is that what makes it different, I guess I would say, from management consulting? And if that is the case, how do you talk with those leaders, those individuals, to point out those difficult things that we can spend, months in our office sort of developing the kind of relationship where we can talk to them about those sorts of difficulties?
Yeah, so in so many ways, you've pre-answered the question in the way that you asked it. So thank you very much. In laying out all of those different subterranean dimensions of the human condition in the leader, almost all of which is either peripheralized or dismissed in conventional approaches to some form of corporate or leadership change initiative. People talk about behavior or character, and there are, psychometric tests that measure what type of character or personality you have, but contending with the deep intricacies and nuances of personality and history that gives rise to what are your strengths and weaknesses, and how do you deploy your talents, and in what ways might they be inhibited or thwarted, or how are you getting in your own way, or how are you stepping on the toes of your team when you think you're doing otherwise, and on and on. These are all ways in which psychoanalytic approaches to working in an organization are assets. So, so many of these different micro elements of the person become foregrounded in the kind of work that I do. It doesn't overshadow any of those other important practicalities. My job is not to come in and posture as an expert in some particular aspect of the business of that business. My expertise is in the inner life of the people who are leading the business, and to help everyone understand that matters, and that who you are in running your business makes a difference in how the business is run.
So when patients come to us, they are suffering in their lives in some way, right? And they have symptoms, and they are aware that their symptoms make them suffer. They are aware that they keep repeating patterns somehow that clearly aren't working well for them. And that ultimately, if stigma doesn't get in the way, may bring them to our office.
Mm-hmm.
In this instance, since, businesses don't tend to think of, oh, we have a symptom here and it's making us suffer. How do businesses know to come to you? And so what kind of referrals, what kind of problems are the problems that present that you get called for and feel in a position to make a difference with?
There are, of course, no differences in many ways between what you just described with the patient and what happens in organizations. It just plays out differently and comes across the doorstep in a different way. So you're right, most organizations are not self-reflective in that way, but often they don't need to be. There are certainly instances where, let's say, there's a leadership challenge, and as a result of various factors, a board may mandate some form of coaching or assistance for a leader, right? So that would be one pathway, which doesn't require that the leader, her or himself, has any self-recognition around actually needing help, but is required to. And then, it's the work of getting that person to cooperate and form an alliance and actually do something that could be productive and constructive. There are also other situations in which there are other externalities that are in some ways kind of glancingly or partially understood as symptomatic of something, even if it's not fully comprehended and diagnosed properly. And so that will lead the organization to think, oh, we could use a certain kind of help. So by and large, no consultancy, whether it's, McKinsey or BCG or any of the big firms or any other firm, will be called in unless the organization has some kind of need for which it has identified that it requires some form of assistance that it doesn't possess in-house. So some form of expertise for which they are willing to expend a budget. And, by and large, that doesn't always or typically include something about the person. But when you're talking about culture or internal conflict or challenges with relationships between partners or in family businesses, or difficulties between boards and management where there's perhaps interpersonal friction or things of that nature, you don't necessarily have to be especially psychologically sophisticated to recognize that it's a people issue, and that perhaps it could be useful to have somebody who has expertise in people to help with that. So that can happen. And just as one specific example, I had a large engagement that started a few years ago, in which another consultancy had been brought in to do a governance assessment of this organization, and they came to understand that in addition to a number of challenges with regard to governance practices and policies, that there were also a lot of interpersonal difficulties with members of the board and challenges of between the board and management, and that they were out of their depth with being able to contend with that. And so it was their recommendation as a part of their solutions package to the organization that another consultant be brought in who had expertise in that area. And so I responded to an RFP and won that engagement, and so started that work. And so sometimes it's a little bit like a patient who has a relative that says, you need help with, rather than the patient, him or herself. And so, there are lots of different ways in which these things can begin.
So without breaching confidentiality, as that is the cornerstone of our work,
Sure.
can you give us sort of themes of the kind of nitty-gritty interpersonal problems that you typically see? Is this like the wildly, narcissistic boss who, is sort of having difficulty meeting the needs of employees because they're very insecure, have to rule with an iron fist to fend off any knowing what's going on out there. We know what's going on in here. What is the typical? What are some of the typical stories of relational difficulties and personality conflicts?
So that's a fairly typical one. So let's start with that. But to pull the frame back just a little bit, it's important to understand that organizational work is systems based. It's not just the individual. So, leadership is contextual. It's not just individual. You can't be a leader if you're all by yourself, except in your own mind. And so, and there's certainly plenty of that, but we'll leave that to the side for a moment. So let's say you have an extremely narcissistic leader who's challenged or handicapped in various ways to properly attend to people on the team or to other situations that are occurring in the organization. By and large, I would push for, if it's not immediately established in the contract, to be able to work with the team as well, so that it's not just one-on-one with that leader. And so the tasks are distributed and not solely focused on addressing the problems, shall we say, of this one person who may be, blinkered or defended or disinterested, or as the case may be, and to be able to effectuate change from the margins in, not just from the center out, and to work with the people who are that leader's direct reports with regard to helping them understand what's it like for you to work with this person. What's activated for you? How are you responding? What does it call up for you? We would say in psychoanalysis transferentially, right? In terms of your earlier relationships and how that prompts you to respond effectively or less so, depending on what's going on for you emotionally. To what extent are you aware of that, and how is that affecting or influencing your decision making, even if you're doing your job well? And so there are all of these subtle ways in which working on the person, not just the person doing a job who has certain credentials and competencies, around the individual, who may be not just the maypole figure in the organization, but the centrally problematic figure, can begin to create a dynamic shift in how things are happening, which then leads to, hopefully, the ability to make some changes with that person.
And how tell us something about the success rate here. How effective, how long do you stay with a business, with an
hmm
organization, and how effective do you feel that this has been?
So I try to temper my idealism and grandiosity with realism. In a sense, perhaps like a surgeon, some patients will die, unfortunately, but by and large, quite successful. And the duration of an engagement really depends on lots of different factors. So, different from establishing clinical treatment that can last, seemingly in perpetuity. Organizations have contracts, and there are deliverables, and there are budgets, and there are outcomes that need to be established and accounted for. And very often we'll come upon the juncture of the potential for contract renewal, and so there has to be a conversation around what have you done. And I'm sorry, somebody is
It's okay. It's
coming
fine.
in
It's
to
okay.
this.
It's
All
fine.
right. Um, okay, sorry.
That's all right.
Um,
Sorry.
and so there will be conversations around what are we doing, what's happening, what needs to be done, are we done, what else can we do? And, so in certain respects, that kind of contractualization of the relationship is a clear differentiator from what would happen with a patient, at least commonly anyway. And so often an engagement may end in a way that I would consider to be premature, because there's a lot more that could be done or should be done, but there's no more budget, or there's no more appetite, or other factors are at play in the marketplace or for that organization. And other times they can go on for years. There are deep relationships that are formed with leaders and with other people on the team. And a little bit of a parenthesis to the thread of what we're talking about regarding duration is that this kind of work is also quite different from clinical work in terms of its social component. I'm often traveling to organizations, going into their offices, going into the boardrooms, meeting with people on their site, not in my office. There are social components in terms of breakfast meetings or dinners, or going on executive retreats to different locations. So there's a whole component to this, which looks and feels very different from what most clinicians would be accustomed to or might consider to be appropriate or technically correct. And perhaps at some point in our conversation, we can get to, how to help more psychoanalysts understand that this is not a bad thing. It's just a different way of using psychoanalysis.
Right. So as psychoanalysts, of course, a patient would come into us and they might be talking a lot about their family or the primary relationship or friendships, but we certainly wouldn't ever meet those people. We would only operate with the perception of those people from the identified patient, right? And that's what's primary. Here, this does sound distinctly different in that you are essentially meeting the family and the other relating people, and watching the, let's say, real dynamic in real time at the dinner, at the meeting,
Mhm.
as opposed to just the patient's perception of that.
Absolutely. And I should add that often I am also actually meeting the family. I've had plenty of instances where I've met the spouses of leaders, and there have been times after a period of time where I'll have a spouse come up to me and say, "Thank you so much. I've seen such a change in, so and so or whatever." And so it's quite interesting and gratifying as well. And
So this work helps them in their work, but it may also help them in their personal life because, of course, that's a porous membrane, work and personal life.
it is, and it should. Of course, many people are extraordinarily compartmentalized, and the goal here is not some form of, complete characterological overhaul, and kind of established predispositions are going to be what they are. But yes, there ought to be carryover from one to the other if what I'm doing is having an effect.
So, as you were sort of alluding to earlier, psychoanalytic training and theory and principles have helped you help this different group of people, this different category. Um, and in that vein, you have called yourself a psychoanalytic activist. Um, so the idea that you can apply these psychoanalytic principles to other important arenas in life. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So, what I mean by that phrase is that it has become a part of my professional mission since that early pivot point just after 9/11, to take psychoanalysis out into the world. I did publish a paper several years ago called Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere, where I articulated a number of my ideas around this, and it included a fairly sharp criticism of psychoanalysis as a profession, in its self-abnegation and its apparent unwillingness or inability to properly respond to changes in the market, with the advent of medication and cognitive behavioral therapy and technologies and lots of other things that have brought about the diminishment and sometimes it seems the near downfall of psychoanalysis, and that is in many respects a self-inflicted wound, about which psychoanalysis can do something and ought to do something. And I'm not going to take all of that on myself and tilt at that windmill alone, but I do think that there are things that can be done with good colleagues like you on the Committee for Public Information and in other ways to burnish the brand and establish for the world at large that psychoanalysis is absolutely relevant, that it's entirely potent and useful. I talk about it as a technology in itself. It is an extraordinarily, and I would say in some respects, peerless tool for understanding the human condition and for being able to bring about change, beneficial change at scale. And it's radically underutilized in so many ways. And I don't say any of that to criticize conventional clinical psychoanalysis, which is enormously important. But going back to your question to me around, how do engagements come in? How do patients come to analysts and what happens when they don't? And it's not just that analysts aren't able to do their work. It's that the work that analysts do is not being done and that something can be done about that.
Absolutely. Um, you and I have spent a lot of time trying to help the world at large, I think, understand that psychoanalysis is really those theories are the underpinning, frankly, of all talk therapy today, including cognitive behavioral therapy. Um, but that, it sort of started with psychoanalysis, but that there are certain principles in psychoanalysis that remain at the crux of helping individuals, or in your case, systems, uh, figure out the problem and alleviate their suffering, whatever it may be, that can't be done necessarily by, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy or medication for that matter.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, in listening to you today, I think a lot of people might say, wow, political leaders and groups might really benefit from, understanding their own internal workings and how that's playing out in their system and how
Hmm.
that therefore plays out for the people they govern, and how that might be helpful. But I guess that's a whole other specialty that it would be nice if those systems would be interested partaking. Um, you've also included recent work having to do with AI, and I wonder if you could just say a few words about how you view that. Our world really turning to AI in so many ways, including in the mental health arena.
Yeah.
How that is affecting your work, or how you think it should affect your work.
One of the ways that I carry my work out into the world is as a regular writer for Forbes. And at this point, I think it may be as long ago as 7 or 8 years, I wrote a piece on the outsourcing of the human condition to technology. And in some respects, it predated the now, kind of apex of AI and its dominance in the world. But some of the ideas that I put forth there, I'm still percolating with and carrying out into things that I'm writing about and doing now in terms of this mistake, as I see it, of techno-solutionism, as it's called, which is utilizing technology to solve problems for which technology is not the solution. And this is now quite prevalent in the world. And as psychoanalysts, we have a lot of deep understanding around why and what's at play. Nonetheless, that's not necessarily doing anything to make it any different. So I'm appreciative that the American Psychoanalytic Association has established through the DPE, the Department on Psychoanalytic Education, the CAI, which is the Council on Artificial Intelligence. And I was tapped to be the editor-in-chief of the CAI Report. We've now put out 2 issues at the intersection of psychoanalysis and AI. And the primary intent there is to just publish a range of pieces with different perspectives on the mental health component, the impact of technology on society, on the human condition, on the ways in which we relate to ourselves and each other, on education, on childhood development. There's almost no limit at this point to the ways in which we are being impacted and influenced by the surge of technology that's omnipresent. So in so many ways, psychoanalysis is deeply important in this process. There has been such a chasm that exists between the development and the release of services and applications that seem not to actually understand or care about the consequences. It's really just about optimizations, efficiencies, and profiteering, which certainly have their validity in the array of factors for launching a business or doing something, but not everything that can be done ought to be done. And even if it is done, needs to be done responsibly and prudentially. And there are many aspects of what happens that need to be understood before you do something.
I think, in the appropriate concern, at least in this country, there are not enough clinicians, and many people can't afford clinicians that are out there, um, that essentially we're underserved in terms of people really being able to get the mental health care they need. And I think, a solution that actually, as we're discussing, isn't necessarily a solution at all, but has been put forward. And, I mean, yes, there's profiteering involved from creating these things, but I think also there are leaders and policymakers who want it to be that you could just, have an analysis on an app. essentially, right? That are saying this is comparable, or this is the solution. And I think that leaves actual psychoanalysts in a tough spot. Um,
Yeah.
how can we genuinely evaluate what might actually be helpful from an AI perspective, helpful to the work, to the prospective patients out there, but not, but also help the public understand where, in fact, it's really not. And instead, you're doing something, but it's not getting to the root of your problem. It's not going to ultimately change the way your mind works or the way your brain is wired in such a way to alleviate your suffering.
Yeah. So two quick things that I'll say. One is I have a new piece that was just published in TAP, the American Psychoanalyst, called Computation is Not Mentation, in which I talk about the significance of embodiment, of actually being in a body, and early childhood development and emotions as irreducibly constitutive of decision making, and that this is a critical dropout area in understanding intelligence, in artificial intelligence, and in cognition, that the foundational understandings of what is a decision and how do we make decisions seems to want to eradicate not just the humanity of it, but the humanness that's required for it. And so, from my perspective, this is an important inroad in helping to develop better computational systems, which is a challenge in itself. You know, how do you actually emulate or synthesize mathematically some of these different aspects of development and affect? But, you know, sort of that technical hurdle aside, at least it needs to be understood as something that is required, and that if you try to create a system that makes decisions or that thinks but doesn't include that, it's not doing anything like how we do it. And so if you release that in an unsupervised way in human affairs, you're going to get decisions and consequences that are at odds with what we might want. And that seems fairly obvious from a psychoanalytic perspective, but is quite novel from a technology perspective.
So well, I'm glad to hear you feel, first of all, that we're not replaceable humans. So that is at clinicians, but also that, what's coming from what you're saying is this, to some degree, right? We will be at odds. I think this is true for actually physicians, and mental health providers and caretakers across the board, that we're going to find ourselves sort of struggling with the technology arm, which, as you
Mhm.
said, is, you know profit motivated, but also efficiency motivated, but also, I think, intellectually motivated, um, to find that Venn diagram for us that
Mhm.
will be safe and effective, but more limited perhaps than technology wishes.
Indeed. And one other point that I'll add here is we must not, I would say, be ostriches about this. Technology is here. It is something to be contended with. And, denialism of any form is completely unhelpful. So, we need to understand what's at play and be able to address it using our skill sets and our expertise, not wish it away and, not hope that it goes away. But the other part of this that I think is very important, you used the word stigma a little while ago in our conversation, and it is enormously impactful in this whole thing. There is this baseline impulse to deride looking at the interiority of the self and to try to eradicate all of these different aspects of who we are, how we feel, how we're fallible, how we're not in control of everything, just everything. And My hope and some of the work that I'm trying to do is to not just destigmatize all of that in a large scale way, but also to be able to help leaders understand the value of integrating an understanding of the human condition and of self in leadership, in the work that organizations do, in the products and services and applications that technology is developing and deploying. Because otherwise, what we're looking at is accelerated decline. And there, so in some regards, I still think that the development of artificial intelligence presents a really compelling and exciting opportunity for psychoanalysis, because it really is grounded in an attempt to understand and replicate something about how human beings think and how we do what we do, and that.
But I think that you're alluding to, how do we at the same time prevent technology as serving as a defense mechanism, right? That essentially it's that yin yang, like, it could help us, but it also it often, in the face of stigma, right, serves as a defense to reduce it,
Sure.
to reduce down the exploration, to not have to look, to feel that you're given a rubric that you could just follow, essentially.
Sure.
And that is a complicated place, and
It
difficult to
is.
tease out. I'm glad to know you're in the fight to do it, because clearly that's where many of our energies have to lie.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and
Thank you.
explaining this really interesting area. And I think the AI conversation to be continued, as that is clearly on the rise and will affect all of us so deeply. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Gail.
Will there ever be a Freud bot? How might it work? Gosh, I hope not. What matters to me in psychoanalysis is the human connection. And if there were to be a Freud bot, it might be very frightening, in that probably AI can generate many competent interpretations, and even to a certain extent something that seems like empathy or evenly hovering attention or some kind of active listening. But I think there's something quite horrifying in the idea that someone would spend time talking to a bot rather than investing in relationships. I'm not sure I can say how it might work. It would work the same way all of the other AI bots work, and I would say that it doesn't work well.
I think you'd have to ask ChatGPT that question.
And what might it say? What do you think it might say?
It would ask something deep about what happened to you as a child. I don't know.
Great.
There certainly will be a Freud bot, because that is how technology works and innovation works, and our society that is, for better or worse, based on capitalism works. Somebody will try to find a way to make psychoanalysis more efficient and technologically friendly and accessible, and those are not bad things. But again, but the Council on Artificial Intelligence and the American Psychoanalyst, the publication of APSA, have had articles on the limitations of AI, specifically around the importance of having had a childhood, which artificial intelligence doesn't have, having a body and the experience of the world that is embodied. These are things that AI is unlikely to ever be able to achieve, and why having an actual human being as part of a psychoanalytic experience and self-understanding will always be important. That's not to say that technology can't help us with mental health, but there are limits to what it can do.
Why do many analysts have an analytic couch? And what are analytic couches like? If we do.
Analytic couches need to be comfortable and create an atmosphere where people feel like they can say whatever they want. People have to be vulnerable when they're in these conversations, and couch allows you to be open.
Two questions. Why do many analysts have an analytic couch? Analysts have analytic couches for at least three reasons. One is history. Freud had a couch, and we connect ourselves with that symbol of the beginning of analysis. Another one is identity. It feels like you're not quite an analyst unless you have a couch. My first analytic supervisor suggested that I was ambivalent about being an analyst since I couldn't afford a couch yet and didn't have one. But probably the main reason is that it's a very important and useful tool to be able to free one's vision from the analyst. Allows the patient to go more deeply inward and look more clearly at their own internal world without having to gauge it against the analyst's reactions. What are our couches like if we do have couches? Our couches say a lot about us. We think as analysts that we are blank slates. We're not. We are always showing who we are, and our couches are as individual analysts are. Some couches are very classical and draped with rugs like Freud. Some are very modern and clean with absolutely nothing on them, except sort of that mid-century style modern. And some are like a living room couch where people can lie down or have family meetings or just be cozy.
Analysts have an analytic couch in order to allow our patients to relax and free associate without having to be burdened by ordinary social obligations, such as eye contact and managing facial expressions and so on. But really, many analysts don't have an analytic couch and work face-to-face. And if we do have an analytic couch, they can come in a variety of different sizes, shapes, colors, and so on. They're just as varied as there are analysts.
Name a psychoanalytic value and how it's useful in treatment. One of the most important psychoanalytic values is the ability to hold complexity. The problems people encounter in life are often complicated. They have many threads. Holding complexity means being able to look at many threads at the same time as a way to untangle them and make better sense of one's experiences.
Thank you for listening in today. We at the American Psychoanalytic Association hope to introduce you to the many ways psychoanalytic thought affects the world around us, and especially you, through this podcast. We would love to hear your thoughts, questions, and requests. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Follow APSA on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or X at psychoanalysis_ with the hashtag APSA podcast. And feel free to send a question or comment. You can find more information about the American Psychoanalytic Association by going to www.apsa.org and listen to more episodes and find bios of our guests online at apsa.org/podcast. If you found this episode useful, please share with a friend or colleague. And we will be back next month with another episode of Psychoanalysis and You. I'm Dr. Gail Saltz, and it's been my pleasure to be your host of Psychoanalysis and You. And now for some Freudian quickies. You sent in your questions for an analyst. I grabbed an analyst with an answer. Till next time.
Will there ever be a Freud bot? How might it work? Gosh, I hope not. What matters to me in psychoanalysis is the human connection. And if there were to be a Freud bot, it might be very frightening in that probably AI can generate many competent interpretations and even to a certain extent something that seems like empathy or evenly hovering attention or some kind of active listening. But I think there's something quite horrifying in the idea that someone would spend time talking to a bot rather than investing in relationships. I'm not sure I can say how it might work. It would work the same way all of the other AI bots work. And I would say that it doesn't work well.
I think you'd have to ask ChatGPT that question.
And what might it say? What do you think it might say?
It would ask something deep about what happened to you as a child. I don't know.
Great.
There certainly will be a Freud bot because that is how technology works and innovation works, and our society that is, for better or worse, based on capitalism works. Somebody will try to find a way to make psychoanalysis more efficient and technologically friendly and accessible, and those are not bad things. But again, but the Council on Artificial Intelligence and the American Psychoanalyst, the publication of APSA, have had articles on the limitations of AI, specifically around the importance of having had a childhood, which artificial intelligence doesn't have, having a body and the experience of the world that is embodied. These are things that AI is unlikely to ever be able to achieve, and why having an actual human being as part of a psychoanalytic experience and self-understanding will always be important. That's not to say that technology can't help us with mental health, but there are limits to what it can do.
Why do many analysts have an analytic couch? And what are analytic couches like if we do?
Analytic couches need to be comfortable and create an atmosphere where people feel like they can say whatever they want.
People have to be vulnerable when they're in these conversations, and couch allows you to be open.
It's two questions. Why do many analysts have an analytic couch? Analysts have analytic couches for at least three reasons. One is history. Freud had a couch, and we connect ourselves with that symbol of the beginning of analysis. Another one is identity. It feels like you're not quite an analyst unless you have a couch. My first analytic supervisor suggested that I was ambivalent about being an analyst since I couldn't afford a couch yet and didn't have one. But probably the main reason is that it's a very important and useful tool to be able to free one's vision from the analyst, allows the patient to go more deeply inward and look more clearly at their own internal world without having to gauge it against the analyst's reactions. What are our couches like if we do have couches? Our couches say a lot about us. We think as analysts that we are blank slates. We're not. We are always showing who we are, and our couches are as individual analysts are. Some couches are very classical and draped with rugs like Freud. Some are very modern and clean with absolutely nothing on them, except sort of that mid-century style modern. And some are like a living room couch where people can lie down or have family meetings or just be cozy.
Analysts have an analytic couch in order to allow our patients to relax and free associate without having to be burdened by ordinary social obligations, such as eye contact and managing facial expressions and so on. But really, many analysts don't have an analytic couch and work face-to-face. And if we do have an analytic couch, they can come in a variety of different sizes, shapes, colors, and so on. They're just as varied as there are analysts.
Name a psychoanalytic value and how it's useful in treatment. One of the most important psychoanalytic values is the ability to hold complexity. The problems people encounter in life are often complicated. They have many threads. Holding complexity means being able to look at many threads at the same time as a way to untangle them and make better sense of one's experiences.